Assalamu alaikum. I am Zaheer Islam Shahab, and today I am with Dr. Nico Carpentier, a well-known researcher and media practitioner. Uh, he is professor at Charles University, Prague, and he is a senior researcher, having published 100 research papers, 200 research articles, and he is among the founders of ECREA. He is the current president of the International Association for Media and Communication Research. Doctor, welcome to Pakistan.
Thank you. Thank you.
How are you doing today?
I'm having a lovely day. It's great to be out in the sunshine. We've been interacting with absolutely lovely students. So my day has been great. My stay has been just as great.
Thank you, sir. Sir, you have been here in Pakistan for the last couple of days. How is your experience so far?
Well, it's my third visit to Pakistan. So apparently I keep coming back. So apparently the experience must be really good. And to be honest, it is. It's a very warm environment. People are extremely welcoming. But there's also lots of academic dialogue and exchange, which I tend to like. So I'm happy.
When you came to Pakistan for the first time, did you observe any cultural shock?
Before I came here, I was told repeatedly that I would have a cultural shock, but no. To be honest, I adjust quickly. I think that when I interact with people, I mostly and firstly see humans. And that makes me always comfortable and in the right place.
What about the food? Are you comfortable with the spicy food of Lahore?
I think the spiciness here is very mild. So it's not that spicy, and I really enjoy spicy food. So I would, at the risk of now being tortured at the next dinner, I would actually appreciate maybe slightly more spicy food.
Oh. That's good. Is there any difference in your view about Pakistan before visiting it and after visiting it?
Well, I think that once you start interacting with people, of course, your perspective changes. It's one of the reasons why we travel. Otherwise, we could just stay at home and keep our fantasies alive. And I think that the always very interesting experience is about how diverse societies are. Because, of course, we are confronted with stereotypes. You know that they're stereotypes. You know that they're not right. But it's still always very nice to see how diverse an enormous society as Pakistan, with its more than 200 million people, how diverse it is, how many different logics, different discourses, different ways of thinking there are. And it's also, talking from a feminist perspective, because I actually consider myself to be a feminist, it's also extremely encouraging to see so many strong women here. And that is so important to see. And maybe that's something that Westerners don't always know before they come to Pakistan. That complexity of gender relationships is fascinating and very important to understand.
Exactly. Let's move to the academic side. What do you think are the current major challenges to postmodern journalism?
Well, it's a very tough question because it is changing rapidly. Obviously, the financial structure or the economic structure of journalism is changing, and the safety net that existed before a stable, fairly stable economic environment has structurally changed. Media organizations are looking for new business models, and it has put a lot of pressure on journalism, and we should acknowledge that. And I deeply respect journalists for functioning in a very difficult environment. Economically, financially, it's really hard for them. So a lot of the certainties that they actually didn't have that much before, we shouldn't romanticize the past, but a lot of the certainties decreased or even disappeared. So I think that is truly important in talking about how we deal with journalism nowadays. It's not an easy job. On the other hand, it never was. So we do have to respect journalists for exposing themselves to this difficult situation. I think that at the same time, there's also the challenge that came out of online media, the diversification. that was very much connected it, the shift away from single platforms to multiple platforms, which also put a lot of pressure on journalism. They have to develop skills in all these platforms with their own logic. So there's this constant readjusting, and that is only strengthened by the 24 hours news cycle. Again, which is very much linked to not just the online. I think that also the news television stations like CNN, when they were created, they also pushed into that 24 hours news cycle. That's rough, because journalism is really struggling with getting the news out there as quickly as possible, which is not always very clever. And there are lots of corrections, which I find quite irritating. It's not a good practice. At the same time, finally, right? Last thing, let's not be too negative. There are lots of journalists doing great jobs, and that is extremely important to stress. Trump, ironically, with his lies, strengthened journalism.
Yeah, exactly.
He motivated journalists to do more fact-checking, to be more accurate, to be better journalists.
Yeah.
Because some of the critiques that Trump launched were not completely outside any reality. I mean, they were absurd, but they touched on some really tricky areas that journalism was struggling with. And journalism reacted and solved, or at least improved, some of these issues and became stronger through it. So they're also in this constant struggle over journalism. There are actually very, very good things happening that are improving journalism.
What do you think about the contemporary information technology? Do you think that it is supporting democratic government, or is it more suitable for a centralized government of authoritarianism?
Well, there are different questions in there. One, is technology good per se? No. Technology is neutral and not neutral at the same time. Technology has affordances, it allows us to do things. Online media have a more decentralized character, and they offer us particular ways of communicating. And in that sense, they're not neutral. They force us into certain directions and they allow us to do things, but we can use technology at the same time for very good things and for very evil things.
Exactly.
And what we see is this struggle between what should we do with it? And when especially online technology and social media became popular, there was this huge upsurge of optimism. Everybody was saying, oh, we will finally see a new world that is participatory, and everybody will be talking together, and we'll have direct democracy, we'll decide together. Exactly. That was utopian, that was nonsense. That was extremely naive, because people very quickly understood that there were business opportunities. So we saw the colonization of the internet by commercial interest, exactly. Political interest, your authoritarian regimes, so that, oh, we have options here. But later also, obviously, companies like Facebook started to create surveillance systems that are pretty decently developed and that do pose serious threats for how we position ourselves in the world and how much privacy we have and how much is known about us. And there's again a very complicated analysis, because, well, sometimes being monitored is not necessarily a problem in itself. The problem is, what can you do with these data in different contexts? What will happen in 10 years if we create surveillance systems that already are uncomfortable and are already violating our privacy? If these data get captured and kept and archived, what will we do with them in less friendly environments? What happens if we go into a more dictatorial regime, which can happen always? What will happen with our data then? So we need to be careful, not just because what happens now, but also what might happen with our data in the future. And that's actually, honestly, my biggest concern. I mean, I see the struggle about privacy now, but what will happen, how they can be potentially abused, that's my real concern. And that's why we think we need to fight these surveillance systems. But technology is neutral in that sense. It can be used to surveil, and it is used to surveil us tremendously. So let's not move into utopian or dystopian perspectives. It's a dichotomy that doesn't work. We need to have analysis. We need to see how power relationships work, how they interact with technology, and let's not assume that it will be good, because that will be naive.
Do you think that we are living under a global digital dictatorship where power is restricted to a few media conglomerates?
No. Maybe I'm optimistic, or maybe I am naive, who knows? But no, I don't think so. I think that I've actually written a short piece about that. I think we're living in the era of both. We're living in the era of very strong control in ways we cannot see. Very Foucauldian mechanics of invisible power. And power that is not to our advantage. So there is a very, very strong tendency to centralization, to control. It's to control over the multitude. It's to control over the many. And that is one half. But on the other hand, and that's why I answer no to your question, on the other hand, we are living in the era of both. We've never had so many opportunities to communicate and to engage in dialogues, to support our activism, to become politically active. We have technology that is supporting us more than it was before. And that is, from a democratic perspective, contradicting the idea of a dictatorship. It is a very paradoxical world we live in, where on the one hand there is permanent attempts to control us, and there are permanent attempts to resist and bypass and to create our own world. And it is happening at the both, at the same time. It's the era of the both.
What do you think? Should the governments censor user-generated content which may be based on misinformation or disinformation, or should it give away as a right to freedom of speech?
There are different traditions in communication and media studies. Coming from a European tradition, I think that some communication is extremely harmful. And we should not underestimate the power of language. It contributes to misery, it contributes to unhappiness, it contributes to people getting killed. If you frame the other, to use a different concept, if you frame the other as vermin, you do that through communication tools.
Exactly.
And that can eventually lead to something like a Holocaust.
Yeah.
And so we should never underestimate how strong communication can work against people. And that, I think, is where a state, where a regulator does need to intervene. So I would not take the US position of almost absolute expression, freedom of expression. That is not my position. I think we need to limit interventions as much as possible. It's not up to the state to intervene when it's not necessary. But in some cases, when it is about racism, about sexism, about abuse, there is a space for regulation. And then, of course, say those proponents of freedom of expression, the absolute freedom of expression, they would say, this is censorship, this is unacceptable. But then I go, but we censor ourselves all the time.
Exactly.
If I would speak my mind to everybody every day, I would have no friends, I would have no life, I would have no job,
Exactly.
I would not exist. So censorship is not necessarily always problematic. It is a tool we can use in cases when the harm that otherwise, without the intervention, would occur would be worse than the act of censoring. So we have to limit ourselves. We have to, as a society, say, this cannot be said because it will kill. And there's, of course, these classic examples, like if you're in a theater room and you stand up and you shout fire and there's a panic and everybody dies because there's a stampede. That's the easy way out.
Yeah.
These are the clear examples. It's much more if you say, for instance, you do not have the right to exist. And if you keep on repeating that, if it becomes structural, and I think that's also one of the one case doesn't matter, it's the structural repetition of the same idea. That's extremely dangerous. That's unacceptable for me. and that legitimates intervention.
Up to what extent a democratic government can impose censorship?
Well, as little as possible. That's the classic answer. I think that if we start focusing on this debate purely on the state, we forget one important other thing, and that's the people. We need to trust people. We need to also educate people. And more than ever, we need to, as educators, we need to explain what language, what communication can do, how harmful it can be, how wonderful it can be in other cases, how important it is to say, oh, you look lovely, but also how important it is not to say you need to die. And there's a lot of online violence.
Yeah.
And that is something which is problematic. But maybe not in all cases a state needs to handle this. Maybe we as people, but also we as educators, need to help and need to start also understanding that these kinds of expressions are just socially not acceptable. Whether they should be legally unacceptable, for me, is a different thing. So I don't propagate full intervention. I actually propagate trust in people and empowering people. But that also means we have to have the responsibility, and we need to take the responsibility to protect these online spaces or offline spaces and keep them civil.
Yeah.
And because we talk about online media a lot, we talk about online violence. But what about bullying in the school?
Yeah.
What happens in a class if a poor kid is victimized by the others? Isn't that exactly the same?
Exactly.
And should the state intervene? No. The teacher should teach the kids and should see it. And because there are lots of bystanders, all the bystanders should intervene and tell their classmates, you can't do that.
Yeah.
That's not fair. You don't treat humans like that. It's our job. And we haven't been doing that enough. We've been that silent majority that looks at the bully and accepts the behavior of the bully instead of saying, you can't do that. And that is where we need education and literacy and training. We need what I would call a participatory ethics. We need to be more ethical when we participate in dialogue and participate in the public sphere.
Yeah. What is meant by the concept of participation? If someone has an access to a media outlet and can interact with it, does he really participate?
Yeah. Well, it's a title of an article I wrote, so you quote me very well. And obviously the answer is no. Because when I talk about participation, I talk about situations where there is a more or less equal set of power relations. And there are different traditions to think about participation. And the dominant one is simply saying, oh, if you're there, it's fine, you're participating.
Yeah.
Right? You're sitting on a bench, you're participating in the conversation. And what these traditional approaches, what they ignore is that there's a power dynamics there and that it's about equality more than just being there. So for me, participation has a much more political meaning. For me, participation is when it's about being present, it's about sharing power. And that makes a whole different debate, because if we talk about, say, participation in government, then you start asking questions, yes, but is voting enough? Or is maybe more participation desirable? Maybe less in some cases. Or if we talk about online participation, is just being online, is that participating in a political debate? Is that political decision-making? Often it's not. So it changes our perspective a bit, and maybe we become a bit more critical and a bit more dissatisfied with current power relations. And maybe we can then once in a while say, maybe presence, access, maybe interaction isn't enough.
Yeah.
Maybe we actually want people to decide together. Talking about students, right? There's something like student participation. Yeah. What kind of say do you have in the university? How much power, how much can you participate? How can you decide together with teachers on the curriculum? How can you decide on university management together? Because students are just as important as professors.
Yeah.
But you don't have that power position. You do not participate. So these kind of questions, and I'm now going to create a revolution here, I understand. So I'll never be invited again.
Yeah.
But they're interesting questions. And maybe everybody agrees we don't need to participate. I think there is the right not to participate. We should have the right to be left alone and not to be involved in a decision-making process, formal or informal. We should be left alone if we want that. But now we quite often want to have a say and we can't. And that's maybe interesting to analyze and interesting to change if considered relevant.
Exactly. What do you think is the next world war going to be an information war? What role media can play in preventing wars and conflicts?
Two separate questions and maybe a strange answer. I think the information war is already ongoing. It's a very strange situation if you take conflicts over the Ukraine now, right? The relationship between European countries and Russia. The information war is already ongoing. So strangely enough, it's information wars which can be very damaging, hacking. They're not really considered acts of war. So in a way, they're like safe. They're like peaceful ways of harassing the other. It's not labeled war, because if you label it war, you go in a whole new dynamics, and then you need to retaliate. So it's not labeled war officially, but a lot of the fighting that is going on at the level of hacking is ongoing. And I think that countries like Russia have excelled in these technologies and structures because it's organized. Right? There are groups of people that actually enter into these systems or try to enter. So honestly, I think that information war already exists and is sort of almost a permanent state of war that we don't call war.
Yeah.
So that's the maybe strange answer. Will it be part of any serious conflict? Absolutely, no doubt. It always has. Propaganda is also information war. The way we construct the other. And that is your second question. Do media play a role? Vital. Because there's a famous quote from Sam Keen, a really nice writer. And he basically says, well, we first think the other to death, and then we invent the battle axe or the ballistic missile to kill them. And I think that's where media contribute. It's not just media, obviously. Society is much more complicated than just media. But media circulate ideas. They make these constructions of the enemy, which are so important in the creation of war, they make them circulate. And they give them significance. They give them visibility and significance. And that's where I think in a lot of conflict areas that I've studied, they play a terrible role. And we do have very serious problems with media being an antagonizing force, media being on the side of war, being on the side of hostility. What I think that I would prefer is to have media play a role of peace, being very careful in how they frame, how they construct reality, how they construct the enemy. Because there are many different ways of constructing the other. And constructing the other as enemy is just one way. You could also construct the other as neighbor. Exactly. You can also start analyzing the position of the other. Going back to Ukraine as one example, I would love to see European media analyze Russia's perspective.
Yeah.
Because Russia's perspective is, I think, quite understandable.
Exactly.
Russia is deadly afraid of having the Second World War repeated, having the Napoleon invasion repeated, having the Nordic War, which is less known, repeated. But they've had 3 main invasions which have killed millions of people. Historically, they want a buffer. They don't want the potential enemy at their gates. I think we need to respect that wish. There is something there. How the Russian regime is handling that, that's another thing. But I would really like to see Western media to at least analyze and communicate that position as well. They hardly do that.
How can we bridge media and academia? What are the reasons for their separation?
What appears to be an easy question is extremely difficult because academia is what I call a semi-autonomous field. We need to be independent. If we stop being independent, we lose.
Exactly.
We destroy ourselves. So academia has its procedures, its ways of establishing truth, and we're good at it. We have a very long history of centuries of education and of research which is about establishing truth. We do that very well. If we become part of another field, we lose that. So we need to protect that autonomy. But of course, we're only semi-autonomous. We're always intersecting with other fields, journalism for one, the media for one, but also politics, the economy. And of course, we should not sort of go inside the castle and raise the drawbridge and never come out. That would be incredibly stupid. It would be going against our social responsibility. But if we go out, which we should not forget that there is an inside. And we should not forget that we are interacting with groups and fields that are different, that have their own logics,
Exactly.
that we need to respect as well. We understand them and we need to respect them. And that is one of the difficulties, one of the real serious limitations, because I think a lot of outsiders don't really understand how academia functions and why it's so important, or they want to incorporate us. Politics is famous for that, wanting to bring us into their agenda, which we should resist at all costs. So the dialogue is vital. We need to learn from them, we need to respect them, we need to support them where we can, but we need to do that on our terms. We should not become them,
Exactly.
because then we will no longer be able to help them anyway. But that dialogue on an equal footing, where we respect them and they respect us, is a very, very difficult process. And there are lots of misunderstandings, lots of expectations that can never be fulfilled, lots of political projects that are aimed at incorporating, and that's a very difficult process. At the same time, I enjoy it. Because if we only talk to academics, we become very strange creatures. And obviously, it's just fun to talk to people and to understand them better, because that's exactly what our job is to understand and to communicate that understanding.
Yeah. Is there any really free media anywhere in the world?
Well, it depends how you define free. If you define it in an absolute way, I would argue there's no freedom.
Yeah.
We are social. We are structured by social structures.
Exactly.
We're co-determined. We have a space of freedom and agency. It's never total. It's one of our many illusions that we have in life, is that there is something like total freedom.
Yeah.
Right? Where you stand up in the morning, you open the window and you shout at the world, I'm a free human being. Well, the fact is that you use language which is actually created for you and it's not yours. You use these concepts of thinking. You're part of a social structure which is economic, which is political, which is cultural. So no, absolute freedom doesn't exist. Do absolute free media exist? No, of course not. They're stuck and structured in their own ideology, in their own culture, in their own ways of doing. And these routines and procedures, they actually make sense in many cases.
Yeah.
But that doesn't mean that they're free. They function in environments that impose their logics on them. And there's a constant negotiation going on how much space media have. I would like to see as much space as possible, but I don't want everything to be media, and I don't want all media to be the same. So we need diversity. We need different types of media, and we need media to be open towards diversity themselves. But will they ever be totally free? Will there be completely free media? No. And I think that would actually be a very bad thing for our world.
Exactly. Do you think there is a correlation between the rising mental diseases and the excessive usage of media, especially the social media?
I think that mental illness is a very significant problem for the 21st century. I don't think we should isolate the role of media from a broader context. I think we are living in a world that makes us ill. We put a lot of pressure on ourselves.
Exactly.
We are not making it easy for ourselves. We forget pleasure.
Yeah.
We are restricted in many, many different ways. We restrict ourselves. We live in a 24/7 economy. We produce. We are exploited.
Yeah. Yeah.
In many different ways, and I'm talking as a Westerner, so I lead a comfortable life. I'm not poor. I'm not confronted with radical poverty as in other places, in other parts in the world. And should be careful there.
Yeah.
But that civilized world, as we like to see it, and that's also, I'm not excluding Pakistan from the world of civilization, just to be clear, obviously. But that civilized world where we've created this new living standards and we are really trying to incorporate as many people as possible in a reasonably comfortable existence, it comes at an enormous cost. And that cost is our mental well-being. And that, I think, we need to restructure. But let's not only focus on media. Media are partially also an instrument on these logics of, let's call them the logics of emptiness. We become emptied. Because we're being dragged into many directions, we lose connection with ourselves. It's a high price to pay, but media do play a role. Screens are important there as part of the problem. We being dragged in front of a screen with COVID-19 even more. So this is not a healthy situation. It's also not healthy for the body, obviously, because there's also a problem with having to sit for too long and not being able to move. And so there's also a bodily, a physical problem. But our mental well-being is and has been for the last 20, 30 years a very serious reason for concern. We've been managing this with medication, which I think is even worse. So the medicalization of the problem, where you first work yourself to death and then are forced to take medication so that your body can actually deal with it, that's the road to hell. That's self-destruction. And that's one of the elements where we have to start rethinking society. For instance, we need to start thinking about working less. So a lot of companies are considering there's this sacred 5-day working week in a lot of European countries, and there is a tendency of at least trying to change that and to decrease it without losing pay, without losing salary, but just to work less. In a lot of experiments, it turns out to be more efficient. People actually are more productive, and they're more happy. So we have made the mistake, especially in the West, of putting so much emphasis on work, connecting it with our private identities. So you're only important if you're successful at work. And that's extremely, extremely destructive. And that is something that especially the West needs to change. That's where we need to de-Westernize the West.
Yeah.
That's where we need to learn from other regions that still have a different perspective and that have not gone that far and have not become that destructive.
As a researcher, how will you define research and what is the importance of research in today's world?
Well, I think this is the most difficult and the most impossible question. How do you define research? Maybe the simple answer is that we're detectives. We want to understand the world and use our academic procedures to do that. And in doing so, we want to speak truth about the world to the world. I think that would be my very sloppy and improvised definition of research. We want to understand the world and communicate it. But there are many, many, many things there because there are many different ways of doing research, there are very different traditions. There are many different objectives, applied research, fundamental research, all these things. And so it's a very sloppy answer. But your second part, help me out.
What is the role of research in today's world?
I think I told you it's a difficult question. I think that on the one hand, academics would say this is very necessary for quite a number of reasons. One is the obvious. If we understand the world better, we can manage it better. If we understand what climate change is, maybe we can do something about it.
Yeah.
Maybe. I'm not saying it's working too well. Maybe. At least we know. We can establish problems and look for solutions. We can do that. That's what research does. That's the obvious. Although it doesn't always work, but it's the obvious. I would say there's more. I think that we also need to create spaces of reflection. We need to say, stop. We need to think first. And our thinking, our philosophy, if you want to have it in these terms, our socio-political theory is important to be created and to be reflected upon, changed, thought. We need to have a space where we can think about things, where we can say, let's not go into the rat race of journalism. Let's not go from day to day. Let's take a month, a year, sometimes a decade, to really think through this particular problem, to look at it from all perspectives and to do it slow. And there's a movement in academia which is called slow science. It's about saying we even need to prevent academia from becoming too quick. We need to slow down, because if we speed up like the rest of the world is speeding up, we will lose our capacity to reflect, and we will lose one of the major roles of academia, and that's to create that chamber of reflection, that space where we can come together and actually think about the world. So the first part of my answer is very much about how to solve societal problems, how to intervene in society, how to help, how to serve society, which is vital. But the second one, maybe we serve society as well by just having that space where we can think and where we can develop theories, ways of looking at the world that maybe immediately are not relevant, but that on the long term will also be very beneficial.
Is there any topic which is very important but is still neglected by the researchers?
Well, I think that that's different in many different spaces, and maybe I have a nuanced answer. If you do research in any topic, and if you look at global academia, there will always be somebody that did the research. So there's always something. There's no topic untouched. In every field, I do a lot of work on participation, and when I started looking in different academic fields, there was always somebody writing about participation. Now, it was a popular topic, but at some point it wasn't that popular. There was still always somebody writing about participation in medical sciences, in environmental planning, everywhere. So there's always somebody. So no topic has been untouched, which is good. Of course, you have processes that are more collective. We also have our agendas, and these agendas are excluding a lot. And there are a number of fields that I find interesting that are, I think, underexposed. One of the areas I work in and have been working on is called death studies.
Yeah.
So all these taboo areas, they tend to be underrepresented, and I think that as academics, we need to talk about these difficult areas, and talking about death, however difficult it is, also personally, because it's very confrontational also for a researcher, it's very necessary. And because of its difficulty, it's a small part of academia. So death studies does exist. But maybe we need to also, in media studies, media and communication studies, we really need to interact with these fields and make them more visible. We've been a bit like little rabbits that are confronted with a flashlight. We've been all staring at online media and social media, and we got so fascinated by it. We became not media deterministic, but social media deterministic. It's like everything was social media, and social media was everything. That's not healthy. We need to look at not just media, not just society. We need to look at phenomena. So we need to combine a media deterministic and or a media-centric approach with a society-centric approach, with a phenomena-centric approach, depending on our interests. And that means also not looking at social media for a while, once in a while. The second example, last example I would give is that for a communication studies perspective, I also like to look at unusual media. I like to look at musea. There is a field called museum studies.
Yeah.
We need to interact with them because a museum is a medium. It communicates, and it does so with particular procedures, just like a newspaper does. They're different, but the mechanics are the same. We need to look at memorials, public memorials. We need to look at art. So there are a number of areas that we just forgot because they're old-fashioned, they're considered to be not relevant, and I think that's a very unhealthy consequence of our total immersion into the research on social media.
Thank you. Would you like to share your best and worst experiences with social media?
Luckily for me, I don't have terrible experiences, so I've always been spared. I think the biggest problem that a lot of people face is the multi-platform logics, where you find yourself more interacting with different social media platforms instead of writing. So I think, and I'm giving a more structural answer, but it's an honest answer. I think that being pulled away from what we should really do instead of playing is quite frustrating, and it's something to be careful with. And I think we all got trapped, including myself. I think that good experiences is mostly linked to how I use social media, because for me, it's not so much a private space. For me, it's a professional space. So I use social media to communicate about my work. That is my decision. I use it in that way. I don't look at it as a private space. I look at it as a professional space. So if then you send out information, open up or try to open up a discussion, and it actually works, that's a big pleasure. We talk about social media as locations of interaction. Well, the pleasure is in the interaction. Yeah. The pleasure is in the response. And again, it's not about, I just had this accident, or I just had this wonderful experience. That's not how I communicate. That's private. I don't like that to be public. But it's like, oh, look, there's this article out and maybe it's interesting. And if people then engage, that's really, really pleasurable. And that's where social media are very strong and very helpful.
Exactly. Thank you very much for your time.
My pleasure.
Very nice to see you. Thank you very much.
Likewise.